Just in the middle. Be silent. So we had a statement from Rav Dimi yesterday on the top of the Amud that said that when you sell something to your friend, even though you wrote in the legal document, I'm telling you the depth and heights. However, if you want to sell the, if you want to sell the things on top of the house, really the higher level, the porch and things like that, you actually have to write, sorry, not the porch. If you want to sell the cisterns and the reservoirs of water, writing in the document, I'm selling you also the depths is not enough. You have to write, I'm selling you, umka da'ara, the depths of the ground. When you say such a language, depths of the ground, that's going to include even the reservoirs of water and the cisterns and the pits. So now, we're going to bring an attack on we're going to bring a support for Rav Dimi. The last two lines of Samik Amad Beis, Toshma. We learned in a brisa. V'leya segag is not sheish lamaka gavoa. Start talking. The Mishnah said when you sell a house and you just write in house, a roof with a fence, if the roof is 10 tvachim, is not going to be included. Now, if you want to say that even without writing anything, you always acquire the roof of the house or the pits of the house, so then when it's 10 tvachim, why have you not acquired it? If you always acquire the things below and above the house, so then you should acquire this also. So must be that these things are not included, and therefore it's like Rav Dimi that when you specify it, only then it's going to be included. So says the Gemara, no, it's not necessarily a proof. Why? Maybe this case is different. Kevan de gavoa asara tvachim chashiv. In this case, it's really asara tvachim. It's 10 tvachim. 10 tvachim has its own chashivas, has its own identity, and it's important enough on its own that that's not really a proof to Rav Dimi. Rav was talking about where you have included or not. Maybe this case stands out because it has such importance. Jules, we're 3 lines from the top on Samach Daled Amud Aleph.
Thank you.
Amarle, welcome. Amarle Ravina Ravashi. Ravina told Ravashi the following: Tashma. We had. I think that Reish Lakish deduced from a statement that we had that those Someres. Remember, we had the son of a Levi who sells a field, and on condition that he gets Ma'aser Rishon, he said when you write on condition and it has total irrelevance because you can't sell, the guy can't promise you future Ma'aser because future tithes because it's not in the world yet. So we reinterpret the Almanas. What it meant was the stipulation meant that the seller actually retains part of the field. Reish Lakish deduced from there, when you sell a house, Hamocher the Amrlo Almanas, and you tell him, I'll sell you the house on condition Shediyuta Ha'elyona Shali, that the top level is mine. So the halacha is Hadiyuta Elyona Shalo, the top level is going to be his. Now we asked, obviously, if you don't stipulate, you'll never get it. So if you stipulate it, of course you'll get it. We said you don't need the Almanas to teach you that you keep the higher level. We'll see what it means in a second. It means the porch. Maybe when a house got destroyed, you have a right to rebuild the porch. Something on top of the house, you get to retain. So we know that already because that's not included in a regular sale of a house. You told us earlier, right? Reish Lakish, what are you deducing? There's nothing new from that statement that we didn't know already. And we had 2 opinions. Rav Zvid and Rav Papa. This is just a review. Rav Zvid Amar Shimrat Lahotzi Ben Zizin Motzi. Rav Zvid actually makes a lot of sense. Rav Zvid says when you sell a house and the courtyard next to the house, if you add in a stipulation, al manas, that you want to keep the top part of your house, since that really has no relevance because you anyways will keep the top part of your house, what does it mean? We understand it to mean that you actually want a portion of the courtyard to give you the right that if you want to put different things that are bolting out of the house, that are jolting out of the house, protrusions, you have the right to place protrusions going from your house into the courtyard, even though you sold the house and the courtyard to the buyer, but you retain a certain portion of the chatzer of the courtyard. What do you retain it for? You retain the right that you can put protrusions into that part of the chatzer. So Rav Zvid was great. We didn't have any problem with him. Rav Papa's one that causes a little trouble. Rav Papa says, Rav Papa Amar Shim Ratza Livnos Aliyah Al Gaba Bona. Rav Papa said, if you want to build an attic, build a floor on top of the house, you are allowed to build it. So now, on this Rav Papa, who's coming to explain Rish Lakish, who had an inference, who had a deduction from the case of Meiser, we're going to ask a question on Rav Dimi. Once again, Rav Dimi said that until you mention the depths of the earth, you have not acquired, the cisterns and the pits of a field. You have to speak it out. The Isal Kadaita, if you're going to tell me Bistama Lo Kani, if anyways the top parts of the house and the bottom parts of the house are not included, and therefore you have to speak it out, because if you don't speak it out, so then you'll never acquire it. So it says the Gemara, Lamali al Menas. What do you need almanas for? Almanas sounds like almanas is irrelevant, and therefore we understand it to mean that you can actually, you still retain the rights to the top part of the house and the bottom part of the house. However, if they're anyways not included and you have to speak it out, so what do you need almanas for? Sounds like from here, really, when you sell a house, you're selling everything. And really, the buyer has the rights to the top of the house and really the depths of the house. But since you wrote the stipulation of almanas, it must be showing us that you actually retain part of it for yourself. And if that would be true, so that's a question on Rav Dimi, because Rav Dimi said that regular things like the top parts and the bottom parts of the house are not included unless you speak it out. But here it sounds like they are included. Therefore, almanas is extra. Once it's extra, so then you retain the rights of part of the house to yourself. So to that we say, not necessarily, not so fast. Ahani le almanas di nafal hadar banila. Really, buyer does not acquire the heights of the house. He does not acquire additional floors to the house. The mocher retains the right to build on the house. The lokech does not acquire that. So, you mentioned almanas. What does almanas do? Almanas tells you that if the house ever falls down, you're allowed to rebuild it, meaning even the porch of the house. Even the porch of the house, you're allowed to rebuild. And therefore, it's not relevant to our discussion with Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi was asking, do you acquire higher parts of the house or lower parts of the house? We're saying now that really this is a different discussion. Really, when the house falls down, do you maintain the right to rebuild even, to rebuild the porch of the house? And that we say that if you put this almanas, a stipulation in, which has no significant relevance, we'll interpret it to mean that you retain the right to rebuild the porch of your house if it falls down, even when it's in the hands of the buyer. Okay. Continuing, sales and what's included and what's not included. So once again, Steve was asking yesterday how exactly they kept their water, where their bores there. If it's in the house but sounds like somewhere in the house they had an area where they would keep their water, because before the sink days they had pits. cisterns in their house, or I guess a place that's really part of the living space of the house. Maybe there's a special section that was part of the house was the water section. Either way, when you sell a house, the Mishnah says if you don't specify, lo es tabor velo es adus. The Gemara is going to explain what the difference between a bor and a dus is. Right now, we'll just explain that they're both areas that contain. So you do not acquire lo es a bor velo es adus. Afal pi shekasav lo umka varuma. Even if you wrote umka varuma, you have not acquired the pit to your house. That's just basically a review of Rav Dimi. That's exactly what Rav Dimi said, right? Lo es a bor velo es adus. Afal pi shekasav lo umka varuma. Oh, now the discussion in the next, maybe daf, a minute and a half. To get to this pit, there's a path, right? So now you build a house, you keep the pit for yourself, the reservoir of water. However, how do you access that reservoir of water? Well, you got to walk through a pathway. So now, how do you get to that pathway? So, is it yours or is it the buyer's? So says the Mishnah, V'tzarich likach lo derech, divrei Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva says, if the buyer now wants to get to his reservoir of water, right? Let's say if the seller wants to get to his water, let's say he lives next door or something, and he just sold his house to his two houses. He just sold one of his houses to somebody, but the reservoir is in that house. Rabbi Akiva says he has to buy it from the buyer. So seller sells house to buyer, and seller retains a pit of water. Buyer has the house. The only way to get is to go through the guy's house, basically. The seller has to buy it back from the buyer. Logic being, we're going to talk about this, but the logic is when a mocher sells, he sells it b'ayin yafa. We assume that when a mocher sells, a seller sells something, he does it very generously. And once he sold the house, included in the house was this area also, was the area to the pit, even though he retained the pit. But since the path was part of the house, so then he sold that path to the guy also. The pit, that's not part of the house. So you can't say the ayin yafa. The pit is not, a house is made for living. A pit is made for, for storing water. So that's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. The Chachamim omrin ein tzarich likach lo derech. Chachamim saying no. When a seller sold the house and he retained the pit, he retains the derech to the pit also. That path to the pit that remains his. And logic being, b'ayin rahu mocher. When the guy sells it, he's selling the minimal amount. No freebies in this sale. So he literally sold the house, and that was it. Nothing else. Not even the path. And therefore, he does not need to go buy it back. It's his. He retains the right to this pathway. Okay. Umoda Rabbi Akiva bizman she'amar lo chutz me'elu she'ein tzarech likach derech. Rabbi Akiva agrees that if you were to specify, I'm selling you a house, except for chutz mibor v'dus. So now hold on. You don't need to say that, right? He just told us 3 lines ago that when you sell a house, a pit is not included, reservoir of water. And now he says, by the way, so now what's going to happen when you sell a house and you write in the document, I'm selling you a house, and not the bor and the dus? Line in the document, which has 0 relevance because it's anyway not included. So what's the halacha when you put something into a document and it has 0 relevance? So to that, Rabbi Akiva says, okay, how do we interpret this? It must be when he wrote, I'm selling you a house except for the pit. What he means to say is, I'm selling you everything except for the pit, even the derech, even the path to get to the, I'm selling you everything except for the pit. What it means is he's retaining for himself the derech. In general, when he sells a house, he sells it generously. So therefore, the path to get to the reservoir of water, the pit, is going to be the buyer's. But when he puts in this clause, I'm selling you a house except for the pit, except for the reservoir. So that has no relevance. So it must be, we interpret it for the seller's advantage, that he retains for himself this derech. Now, the Rashbam points out that that's very good for Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva usually assumes that the path to get to the bore is sold with a house. So the Rashbam says, so this has zero relevance, and we can't interpret it anyway. Now, we're not going to make up something random. Oh, yeah, and by the way, he retains the living room for himself, because that would be a contradiction to selling a house. So the Rashbam says, he just wrote it, it's there, but so just for extra specification, so that the buyer shouldn't say, you sold me the whole house and you didn't leave me a path. So this way, he specified, I'm selling you the whole house except for the pit. He just specified, not everyone knows where the pathway is. So you're just making it clear. I'm selling you everything except for the pit. Included in that is going to be a pathway. Fine. That really is the first part of the Mishnah. This machlokas Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. When you sell a house, do you sell it with a generous eye or more of a stingy eye? Second case, machran ma'acher. So now you sell just the pit, the reservoir of water, the place that you've been storing your water for many years. You sell that. However, so now when you sell that, does that come with the pathway to get to the pit, or you're only selling the pit? So now you can imagine the guy lives in a house, and somewhere in his house, maybe in the back room, there's a walkway in the house, and then there's a walkway that takes you to the bore. So now he just sold the bore. Does the walkway come with it? So says Rabbi Akiva, of course it comes with it. Einot sarich likach lo derech. The buyer does not need to acquire the path to get to the pit. Why? Because the seller sold it, the ayin yafet. The Gemara is going to ask why you need both cases to teach you that Rabbi Akiva holds that you sell things with a generous eye. So the Gemara is going to talk about that. And the Chachamim hold like they held in the beginning of the Mishnah also. They say, sorry, you sold the pit and just the pit. All you sold was the reservoir of water. You're generally sales go. People sell things more stingy. They're more stingy about their sales. And therefore, the pathway is not included. And for if the buyer wanted to acquire a pathway to the pit, that had to be in a separate purchase.
I just recently saw a report about a guy who bought a property for development, and it was accessed by a private road. And so he bought it, and then the city wouldn't allow him to develop it because he needs direct access to a public road.
Mm-hmm.
So this is
similar to that, right?
He bought it without access.
It's interesting because when we have so many assumptions when you sell a house, of course, comes with the driveway. But we see that the word house, at least in halacha, has a definition, and a backyard has a definition, a driveway has a definition, if you define all your terms. Okay. So now the Gemara really is going to just define for us what are these two words, a bor and a dus. And then really it's going to be an entire Amud all about this idea of ayin yafet and ayin ra. We're going to have, I think, 3 cases, 2 from our Mishnah and 1 from a later Mishnah that we're going to try to figure out. Is really the logic of Rabbi Akiva that a seller sells things generously, and Chachamim argue on that, or maybe there's other logic. We're going to bring some questions, some proofs back and forth, and then at the end of the day, we're going to conclude that he actually does agree that a seller sells things generously. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. Yosef Ravina Bekakashule. Ravina sat down and had a question. Hainu bor, hainu dus. The Mishnah is 2 things. To me, it's 1 thing. It's a place that holds your water on the ground. You dug a hole in the ground and you put water in it. That's a bor and a dus. But yet it's 2 separate names. Must be 2 separate things. But he didn't know what it was. Rav Tosfat said to Ravina, Tashma, I'll bring you a brisa. Titania echad bor ve'echad ados bekarka. Ella, both a bor and a dus are both in the ground. What's the difference? The difference is Ella shehabor bechafira vehadus bebinyan. A bor sounds like all there's really dirt around it. Hadus, you have like some kind of softer dirt that you build a little structure around it. Sounds like it's really the walls are being stood up by by some kind of brick or stone. So one is really just in the ground, and one has a stone structure around it. But essentially, they're both things in the ground that hold water. Jared, we're towards the bottom of 64a. Yeah. Rav Ashi also had a similar question. What's a bor and what's a dos? I'm related Mark Shisha Breder Rav Chisla Rav Ashi. Same thing. Tashma the Tanya echad bor b'chados b'karka el shabor b'chafira v'hados b'binyan. That a bor is just in the ground and a dos has this stone structure around it. Jared, you see two dots, last two lines.
Yeah,
catch up with the mission. So the mission just told us that part of your house you have a bor, it holds water. Now you sell a house, that is not included. You got to specify that. However, what about the pathway to get there? Is that included or not? Rabbi Akiva said it is included because a person sells things generously, and the Chum say it's not included because a person sells things with a stingy eye. Okay, so now we're going to discuss this idea of stinginess versus generosity. Ma'ilav b'hakam iflagi. Says the Gemara, what's the logical understanding of their argument? Rabbi Akiva, turning the page. Rabbi Akiva savar mocher b'ayin yafa mocher. Rabbi Akiva says that a mocher, when someone sells something, right, even though they want their money, and people are usually very careful and very strict with their own money. However, the ayin yafa mocher, he's selling it with a generous eye, and therefore, even though the pit was not sold, the reservoir of water was not sold to the buyer, but the path was, because the path is part of the house. Yeah. Rabbanan savri mocher, b'ayin ra mocher, and the Rabbanan agree that a mocher sells things b'ayin ra, with more of a stingy eye. And that's the logical understanding of the machlokas. That's why for Rabbi Akiva, the path goes to the buyer, and for the Rabbanan, the path is retained to the seller. And if the buyer wants it, has to be in a separate sale. Okay. This is not the first place we have Rabbi Akiva, who says that a mocher is b'ayin yafa mocher. We have cases by a person sells trees. The Rambam brings from Lamed Dynamite base. You sell trees, and and there's a little bit of karka, a little bit of land that's retained. So according to Rabbi Akiva, you acquire the land around the tree also. Why? Because he sells it generously. He knows that a tree might need to be replanted right next to it. So you have a variety of cases where you see that Rabbi Akiva is selling things, and certain things come along with the sale because he sells things generously. The Amar mocher b'ayin yafa mocher. So now, yeah. So the Gemara says, the source of that is mehacha. Mehacha is the source that Rabbi Akiva sells things generously. On that statement, that this is the source, that Rabbi Akiva, our mission is a source of this ruling of Rabbi Akiva, that a seller sells things with a generous eye, we're going to ask on that for the remainder of the Amud, and then conclude that it really is the source. Okay. Mimai, really, from this case of our mission, when you sell a pit, but when you sell a house, the pit you don't sell. The pathway to the pit you do sell. That's included. Is that really because it's b'ayin yafa? Maybe it's for a different reason. What's that reason? Dilma Rabbi Akiva saw another wrote Sashit and Ma'osav. But the buyer has a very good claim. The buyer doesn't want people he doesn't want to give money and have people trampling through his property. So when you sell a house, yes, the pathway in your house, which also happens to go to the reservoir of water, that pathway is also sold to the buyer. Because buyers, when they're paying for something, they don't want, no strings attached. They don't want, he wants to get some water. So therefore, of course, when he gives money, he's acquired that pathway also. So that has nothing to do with a generous eye. That has to do with just, get into a mind of a buyer and therefore we assume that the path is sold with the house. What do the Rabbanon hold? The Rabbanon say, "Ein adam rota shital ma'osav v'yifrach ba'avir." So the Rabbanon say, okay, think about it. The seller has to get to his reservoir of water. So even though he accepted money, fly the air to get there. I mean, how is he going to access his reservoir of water? The only way is a jetpack, right? So he doesn't want to go use a jetpack to get to his reservoir of water. So of course he retains the pit for himself. So basically, you can understand this machlokas in a different way. It's how do we assume? Do you go after the mind of a buyer, or do you go after the mind of a seller? But that has nothing to do with ayin yafe, ayin ra, a good eye, a generous eye, or a stingy eye. Okay, so from that case, the first case of our Mishnah, we cannot deduce that this is the source that Rabbi Akiva understands that we sell things with a generous eye. The elam is seifa, but what about the end of our Mishnah, where you sold the pit? Rabbi Akiva said you sold the pit and the path to get there. Rabbi Akiva says you sold. That's Rabbi Akiva, and the Chamim held you sell the pit. You sold the pit, but you did not sell the path. The elam is seifa, bakar la'acher. You sold your pit, your sister, your reservoir of water to somebody else. Rabbi Akiva Omer eino tzarech ligach lo derech. So the buyer acquires the path. He doesn't have to reacquire a path. The Chamim Omer tzarech. You do have to. So Dilma b'hai pligi. Rabbi Akiva sar basar daita delokecha. What's the arguments that you go after the understanding of the lokech? Since buyers generally don't want people trampling through their property, so therefore they acquire the path to their pit. And the Rabbanon, they say no. We generally look at the understanding of a mocher, and therefore he's going to retain the pathway for himself. 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So the Ella maybe we can learn that Rabbi Akiva understands that a mocher, a seller, usually sells things generously from a case later on. Now it's a case of a field. You sell a field. What's included in a field? So the Mishnah tells us on Daf Ayin Aleph, we'll see soon, that what not included in a field are a pit that holds water, below us a gas, not a wine press, below es hashovach, and not some kind of a dovecot, a place where a birdhouse, some kind of little house for the birds or doves. Bein charev, bein yishum, whether you actually still use these things. Charev like means to be dried out, meaning whether it's not used, bein yishum, whether it's occupied. So even if you don't use these things, they're still not included in the sale of a sada, of a field. B'tzarich likach lo derech. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. But yet, the seller, if he wants to access them, has to buy back the pathway to get there, because that was sold with the field to the buyer. The Chachamim Omrim eino tzarich. You don't need to. So says the Gemara, hold on. Why do you have to teach us in our Mishnah case of a house and the exact same scenario by a field? Hasulamali, it's repetitive. It must be to teach you that a seller sells things, and the Rabbanon teach you that a seller sells things with a stingy eye. So you need from our Mishnah, we said earlier, you couldn't learn out that this is the source. But once you have the Mishnah later on, which has the identical scenario, so what's it needed for? It must be needed to teach you the general rule that Rabbi Akiva sells things, that Rabbi Akiva says when a seller sells things, it's the ayin yafa with a generous eye. And the Rabbanon, they hold that when a seller sells things, it's more of a stingy eye. Okay, so that would be a good source. Says the Gemara, not so fast. You made an assumption that the case of a house and the case of a field is totally redundant. But maybe if you would explain to me why you need to teach me the case of a field and it's not redundant, then you've lost your source that Rabbi Akiva sells things b'ayin yafa generously, and the Rabbanan say that you sell things with a stingy eye. So what would be a reason to teach me the case of a sada if it's the exact same case as a bias, as a house? So says the Gemara the following: V'dil mashmin and bias, v'kamashmal on sada. Even though I taught you that case in our Mishnah of a house and what's included in a house, and the pathway is included in the house, and then I told you the exact same case by a field, that the pathway is included with the field, says the Gemara B'tzrika, I need both cases. Why? The iyashmin and bias, if I only tell you the case that a path is included when you sell a house, that's because mishum debayitz niusa. It's a private place, and therefore the buyer will buy the pathway also because he wants his privacy. He doesn't want someone coming through his house. Aval sadeh, it's not a private place. So there's a field. Everyone drives by the field. Everyone walks by the field and sees what's there. Aimalo, maybe there you would have said that a buyer does not necessarily acquire the path. Kamash Malon, it tells you that even though it's not tznius like a house is, the buyer still retains the path to the field. The buyer does buy the path to the field. Now let's say I only had the other case. V'yashmin and sadeh mishum de kashle davsha. A sadeh, when you keep trampling upon it, you keep stomping on it, you keep walking upon it, it's not good. It's not good for the field. So maybe there I had to teach you. That's why a buyer acquires a path to the field, a path to his reservoir in the field, right? When you sell a field, the path comes with it because you don't want the seller, walking through all the time on your field, harmful to the field to always be stomping on it. Aval bias, it's not harmful to walk in a house. Aimalo, maybe you'd have thought that over there, since it's not harmful, a seller would retain the rights to the pathway. Kamash Malon, that even by a house where it's less harmful, so where it's not harmful, the buyer still acquires the pathway to the reservoir. So, since I need both cases, I no longer have a source that Rabbi Akiva, that he really has this rule that a seller always sells b'ayin yafa, and the Rabbanan always sell that when a seller sells things, it's b'ayin ra, with a stingy eye. So we tried from the case of a sada, and we tried from the case of our Mishnah, it didn't work. A bias, we tried from the case of a sada, and we explained how you actually need each case. So now we're left with the third, the last part of when you sell just the bore, just a reservoir of water to somebody else, does a pathway come along with it? Rabbi Akiva says yes, and the Chum say no. Rabbi Akiva says that the buyer does not need to go buy himself a pathway to the reservoir of water which he had just acquired. Now here we're talking about a reservoir of water in someone's house, and all you've sold is a reservoir in someone's house. And yet, Rabbi Akiva says the buyer gets the reservoir and the pathway. Come say no, he gets a reservoir and not the pathway. So says the Gemara, Hasulamali, Hainuhach. That's the same case as the first case of the Mishnah. We're both talking about inside of a house, and yet Rabbi Akiva still says the guy gets the pathway. Now, anything you want to say that a house is different and you need to teach you about a house, we already said that from the first case of the Mishnah. That was the first thing we tried. That maybe you'll go into the head of the lokeach, or you'll try to go into the head of the mocher, but now you have the exact same case in the seifa. For what reason? Why do you have the exact? It's a different case, but it's the same principle that with the pit comes the path, and the first part of the Mishnah taught us with the house comes the path. So what do you need it for? That finally we found a source. Ha kamash malon. This is the case. From here we see that really Rabbi Akiva tells us that a mocher really sells things by ayin yafa, and a lokea and the Rabbanan say a mocher sells things by ayin ra, with a stingy eye. So that's really the case. Now once you have that rule, so then you can say that's also the understanding in the first part of the Mishnah. Just the first part of the Mishnah couldn't be the source of the rule, because we could have asked on it, maybe teaching you something else. But once we have a repetitive case in the Seifa, so now we know that that's really the source of Rabbi Akiva, and this is where we get this idea from. Okay. So now we have a machlokes Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. When a seller sells things, stingy eye, worth the things or are they not included until you specify? So who's the halacha like? Itmar Rav Huna Amar Rav halacha kedivrei chachamim. That makes sense. Usually when you have a singular opinion against a multitude, you go after the multitude, you go after the chachamim. So Rav Huna says in the name of turning the page to Samachem and Aleph. V'Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Shmuel halacha Rabbi Akiva. He says the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. So Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, halacha is like the Chachamim, and Rav Yirmiyah in the name of Shmuel, halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. So now, Rav Yirmiyah says to Rav Huna, Amar le Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba le Rav Huna. Did you really say in the name of Rav that the law accords with the Chachamim? Did you really say that? Because Zimnan Sigin Amrisa Kamei the Rav Hilchasak Rabbi Akiva le Amar le V'leimidi. Many times, it was said in front of Rav that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, and Rav remained silent, which means that agrees with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and yet you came and you said in the name of Rav that the halacha is like the Chachamim. I'm just very confused right now. How could that be? How could you say the halacha is like the Chachamim and you sell things with a stingy eye when many times in front of Rav it was said halacha is not like the Chachamim, like Rabbi Akiva, and he remained silent? Why would he remain silent? If so Rav Huna suspects that when Rav Yirmiyah would say the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, and Rav was silent, he's not sure that Rav Yirmiyah was asking correctly. So he says, Amar le heichi tanisa. 1 second. How did you ask Rav your question? So Amar le ibcha tanina. He said, I would ask it in the opposite, meaning I would tell him that Rabbi Akiva is the one who says that a person sells with a stingy eye. So he says, yeah, and the Chachamim are the ones that say he sells it with a generous eye. So, meaning he would flip the opinions. So Rav Huna says that's why Mishum Hachi la Amar Lach V'lo Midi. That's why Rav didn't respond to you, because Rav agreed that the halacha is a seller who sells with a stingy eye. So if you presented him the question that Rabbi Akiva is the one who holds he sells with a stingy eye, so Rav's going to agree to that, because he holds when you sell stingy eye. The Rishpam just points out here an interesting thing. It's not that Rav Yirmiyah knew. It's a funny story right now. It seems like Rav Huna says halacha is like the Chachamim, and basically Rav Yirmiyah is like, yeah, but when I presented the case in the opposite order, Rav said nothing. He didn't respond. So that's what kind of question is that? That's not a question on Rav Huna. They're both saying the same thing. Rav Huna said halacha is like the Chachamim, and Rav Yirmiyah is like, yeah, but when I said over, the opinion of the stingy eye, I said in the name of Rabbi Akiva, and Rav said nothing back to me. So okay, so all you're saying is that Rav agrees that when a seller sells, he sells with a stingy. What's Rav Yirmiyah still about? So the Rashbam says Rav Yirmiyah he didn't say I taught it in the opposite order, meaning who held like what? The Gemara is just saying Rav Yirmiyah presented these things in the opposite order, but he didn't know that that was an issue. To that, Rav Huna clarified for him, well, yeah, you should know, you flipped the order. That's why Rav didn't respond. It's not that Rav Yirmiyah knew he flipped the order and he still had a question. Rav Yirmiyah didn't know that he flipped the order. So the Gemara is really saying, Amar le ibcha, I said the opposite. The Rashbam says, no, it's not that he knew he said the opposite. So the Rashbam here says, Ihulo Amar le Rav Huna lashon that ibcha tani. the Gemara says, I said the opposite to Rav. So just the Gemara is saying that. Because if he knew that he said the opposite, and he wouldn't ask a question on Rav Huna, it's the same thing. It's just the Gemara is adding that in, and the Gemara is pointing out that happened to be that Rav Yirmiyah presented him the opposite case, and that's why he was wondering, how could Rav Huna say what he said? Yeah. So Rav Huna clarified for him, you should know your opinions are switched. This is why Rav didn't say anything. So because you flipped the opinions. But the way I'm saying it, the opinions are not flipped, and that's why the halacha is like the chachamim. Either way, the halacha is like the chachamim according to Rav, and according to Shmuel, the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. It's interesting to me that we have here, I guess, an example. The halacha always is in how we decide halacha, yachid v'rabim, halacha kirabim. When you have a minority against the majority, you always go after the majority. Every so often, the Gemara will ask, like, why the Mishnah quota? Minority opinion, if we don't hold like it. It's like Gemara will say, no, it's a really good minority opinion. If it makes a lot of sense, we will go like that. So here seems to be an example, at least according to Shmuel, that Shmuel will go like Rabbi Akiva, not like the Chachamim. Yeah. So Amar le Ravina le Ravashi lema azdil taimayu. Okay, Rav and Shmuel have a machlokas. Rav holds a seller sells with a stingy eye, like the Chachamim. He sells his eye like Rabbi Akiva. Says Ravina to Ravashi, yeah, they go according to their reasoning. Dam Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. What happens in the following case? A father dies, and now brothers have to split up the field. So each one has a portion in each part of the field. So when they're splitting the field, they're in essence selling things to the other, right? If you own a portion in 100% of the field, every step in that field, every brother owns a portion of that step, of that, square foot. But now, hold on. Now you want the right side of the field, and you take the left side of the field. So you're selling your portion on the right side of the field. He's selling his portion in the left side of the field. So, they're splitting an inheritance, but it's really very similar to a sale, because you're basically giving up your portion in exchange for everyone else's portion in your field. So achin shechilku. So the case here seems to be you have two fields that were passed down in inheritance. So now you split up the field. So the following are true. Ein lahen lo derech zelzeh. If one has an inner field, one has an outer field, right? So when the outer field guy, when the inner field gave up his portion of the outer field, so he also gave up the pathway that came with the outer field. So now basically the only way to get from the inner field, through the outer, but he gives also not just the outer field, he gives the pathway to Velo sulamos elzeh. A guy takes the top story of a house versus the middle story of the house. He gives up his ladder also. He doesn't retain the ladder. Velo chalonos elzeh. Windows that that are going to block the sunlight from coming in. That's also given with the house to the other person. Velo amas mayim zelzeh. Irrigation system, which is going to irrigate his part of the field, but that's also given with when you give a field, you give the amas mayim also. The hizar bahen shehalachos kvuos, and you should be careful with these because these are set halachos. So that's all the opinion of Shmuel. The Rav Amar yesh lahen. So Shmuel says when you split up a field, all those things come with the field. A pathway comes with it, and the ladder comes with it. Windows, irrigation system. Why? Because when you give up your portion of a field, you're giving it up ba'ayin yafeh, generously. Not just the field, also the path. That's the opinion from before. Shmuel holds halach like Rabbi Akiva. Yeah, a seller sells things with a generous eye. But Rav Amar, no, yesh lahen. I gave up my field. I gave you the outer field. I retained the pathway. I didn't give you that. I gave you the bottom portion of the house. I'm retaining my ladder, etc., etc. So as you see, Rav and Shmuel are consistent. Says the Gemara, Sricha. I need to teach you both of these cases. The case of a seller and the case of a splitting up of an inheritance. Why? Diashmin bahi kamar Rav mishum the amarle ba'inin lameder ba ki heichi dedaru be avasi. So I need to teach you that even by the case of an inheritance, Rav says that, of course, by when you split up an inheritance, you're not giving up anything extra, because you can always say, I want to live here just like my father lived here. He wants to live just like his father had. That's what he wants. So we're not going to assume that he's giving up more of his property than is stated. So if he gives up a field, he's not also giving the path to the field, because that's not the way his father lived there. However, Teda, the Ksiv says in the pasuk, "Takas avasecha yubanecha," right? In place of the fathers will be the children. So too are the children. That's by a field, which is getting split up by inheritors, by brothers. Aval behava, maybe by a house. Rav will agree when you sell a house and you sell the pit's not included. Maybe the path is here. The teeth by the Rav says you sell things with a stingy eye. Now the other way, maybe Shmuel only said by a house that the path comes along with it. Aval beho, when it comes to an inheritance, ema modele l'Rav. Maybe there he'll agree to Rav that when you're splitting up a field between brothers, so each brother wants to live there exactly the way his father lived there, and therefore he's not going to give up his field with a generous eye. He'll give it with a stingy eye. Kamash that Shmuel says even by the case of an inheritance, it's split up with a generous eye. And Rav says even the case of a house is going to be split with a stingy eye. Amrle Rav Nachman Rav Huna, Hilchasa Kivasin or Hilchasa Kivasayu. So Rav Nachman said to Rav Huna, is the halacha like you or the halacha like them? Meaning Rav Huna said halacha is like Rav. So Rav Huna said halacha like. So Amrle Hilchasa Kivasayu. 1 second. Yeah. So Hilchasa Kivasayu. Why? The Makrivisu Be Reish Galusa. So he responded to him that the halachas Kivasayu, the Makrivisu Lebava the Reish Galusa, the Shriche Daini. So Rav Huna tells Rav Nachman that the halacha is going to be, how does it say, Steve? It sounds like Shmuel. Shmuel, right?
It says the halacha is according to what you use for the Rav.
Meaning, Rav Nachman was a Talmud of Shmuel. So Rav Nachman says, who's the halacha like? Like Shmuel or like Rav?
Rav Huna
says the halacha is like you. Yeah, exactly. Rav Nachman was a Talmud of Shmuel. Halacha is like him because you're next to the Reish Galusa and you see all the cases that come out of there. And all those cases you know better than me. So if you see the halacha is like Shmuel, it must be that all out of that house. So the Reish are like Shmuel.